Welcome everybody to another episode of JewishDrinking.com, the show. And I'm really stoked because today we've got with us Gabriel Geller, the Director of Public Relations, Advertising, and Wine Education for Royal Wine Corporation, correct?
Yep, Royal Wine Corporation, which is well known in the Jewish world simply as Kedem.
People may have watched the previous episode we had with Professor Roger Horowitz, who did an entire chapter in a book about the history of Manischewitz wine. I know a lot of people were very curious about it, but in that episode, he also began speaking about Kedem, about Royal Wine Corporation, and I reached out to Gabriel Geller. Here he is. So I'm really stoked to have you on today, Gabriel. And quick question: are you drinking anything right now?
Well, not right now, but just a few minutes ago, I actually was.
Yeah.
The bottle is empty.
All right. Sounds
That's
good.
okay. There are many others. Thank God.
Sure.
I was drinking the Agafen Dry Riesling 2018, and I think it's important to actually mention it because I think that you want to talk about the history of kosher wine, right?
That's right.
And Agafen is very important because it was the first kosher winery in the United States, and it's still standing there. It's a estate winery. That means that they have their own vineyards. They cultivate their own grapes, the grapes that they use to make their own wine, in the heart of Napa Valley, California.
So very inappropriately for our episode, I'm actually drinking beer. So I've got some
Scandal.
West Coast IPAs. I'm working on a Washington State one, and then I got an Oregon one up next. But I know, maybe one of these days I'll get into my wines. Originally, the premise was to speak specifically about the history of kosher certified wine in America, in the United States, and I still do want to talk about that. But I know you have, I suspect, a broader context, really, more than just the U.S., correct?
Well, that's true. As far as Royal Wine, the company, is concerned, and as far as I am concerned, also personally.
I'm curious, how'd you get to where you are now? What's been your wine journey? And then we can talk about the broader history. But let's start with you and your history.
Okay, sure.
Yeah.
Well, so I was born and I grew up in Switzerland, in a town called Lausanne. It's about 40 miles from Geneva, a small Jewish community, which was very dynamic. It still is somewhat, but it's not exactly the same as it used to be. Um, and I made Aliyah. I moved to Israel at the age of 14. I was still going back to Switzerland very often for vacation because I made Aliyah by myself. My parents were still living in Switzerland. And so I was going back for vacation, summer, winter, Hanukkah, Sukkot, etc. One of those summers when I was 16 years old, I wanted to make some money during my vacation. And I
Yeah.
went to work for a local wine importer and distributor who was Jewish, but he was dealing almost exclusively with non-kosher wine, some of the most prestigious, well-known wines from all over the world, Bordeaux, France in particular, but not only. I found that to be fascinating. There was a big library there in the office with lots of books about wine. And during my lunch break, I was like going through the books and reading about, and I wanted to understand because what I was doing all day was a lot of different things, helping with like accounting, the books, schlepping stuff in the warehouse, stuff like that.
Yeah.
And I saw those bars of wine. Some of them were in wood crates. Some of them were just in cardboard boxes. And I knew that there are bottles that cost $600 a bottle and bottles that cost $10 or even less than that. And I was like, it's the same. It's 750 milliliters each. Why is this one so much more expensive? What's
Yeah.
the difference? They look. I mean, besides for the label, of course, they look the same. It's not like the difference of, say, a Lexus and the Subaru.
Yeah.
We're talking about packaging which is roughly similar. I wanted to know more about that. And I understood the history of the wine growing regions, the history of winemaking, the traditions, the savoir-faire, as we call it in French, really the craft of producing wine, in different manners, and the importance of the terroir, the soil, the climate, all those things. It was really fascinating to me.
Okay.
And so when I went back to Israel after my vacation and after working there, I really wanted to know more about wine. I already liked wine. I was only 16 years old, I know, but I grew up in a home where my grandfather was very French. He always had a glass of wine every single day, not just Shabbos, every single day with lunch and dinner. Really classic French. So I grew up around wine. It was part of the culture in my family.
Wait, so even lunch, you're saying in French culture, even for lunch, a little wine?
Even for lunch, yeah,
Oh.
even for lunch. Only for breakfast they don't have wine. And even then, I'm sure that there are some people who do, but that's a different category. And let's not get into that. Back in Israel, every Shabbos, I wanted to try something different. And I was buying with what I could afford as a teenager back then, and always trying different varieties, different wineries, reading about, there was a wine critic whose name was Daniel Rogoff, the first Israeli wine critic, wine writer. He really put Israel on the world wine map. No one really cared about it before. He had that guide that he published every year with every single Israeli wine that was produced, with a tasting note on each and every wine, a score, a drinking window. What's a drinking window? Is when the wine is not too young, it's ready to drink, and until when it will approximately expire. So it was very insightful. Since I was really an amateur back then, I needed guidance like that. But as time went by, I also learned to trust my own palate, my own preferences, and it was not just about Daniel Rogoff or anyone else recommending a wine. I was tasting the wines and I was deciding for myself, of course, whether I liked it or not. Really, that's how my appreciation grew, my knowledge grew, and I started writing tasting notes myself, publishing them online, with people following me, etc., etc. And I returned in 2011 from Los Angeles after spending a little bit over a year. I opened a wine store in Yerushalayim, which was called the Wine Mill. Together with a friend who really got into wine because of me. Because before moving to LA, I became a wine consultant for that same importer I worked for as a teenager. I didn't work for that importer just that one time when I was 16. I went back to work there like almost every single vacation. It was good money, and I liked the work. That same importer who knew that I had acquired some knowledge and appreciation for wine over the years hired me as a consultant when I was in college to help them find fine Israeli wines to import into Switzerland and to sell those wines not just to the Jewish community, but also to the fine wine drinkers out there who were looking for something new and different. From being a consultant, I became a wine retailer in Israel. That adventure of being a wine store owner and manager lasted about a couple of years. And then I went back to be a consultant, worked really with a lot of different wineries and importers of kosher wines and Israeli wines all over Europe and America. I moved to New York, working as a consultant for an Israeli winery on a 3-month mission. And that Israeli winery, Netofa, the importer of that winery was Royal Wine. Royal Wine is the #1 importer, distributor, producer of kosher wine in the world. And they're like, when I met with them, they're like, it's great you're helping Netofa, but why don't you come and help, all those Israeli wineries, not just the Israeli wineries, all those kosher wine producers whom you have connected with over the years. You should just come work for us at Royal Wine. That's what Herzog, the CEO, told me. Said, this is your home. He made me an offer. I accepted that offer.
So aside from telling the world about Royal Wine, what's included in your job responsibilities?
All right. So telling the world about Royal Wine is really a very small part, because I usually don't tell the world about royal wine. Royal wine don't want me to tell the world about royal wine. Usually they want me to tell the world about the wineries that we represent, the wines that we represent. It's all about providing public relations, PR, getting the word out there for those great wines and great wineries.
Okay.
Royal Wine is a corporate entity, and that's about it. To the regular consumer of kosher wine, it doesn't matter who Royal Wine is. What matters is
Kedem, whether it's Kedem or
yeah,
any of those other the brands that they have.
exactly.
I mean, promoting those brands, right?
Promoting those brands. So it's promoting those brands with the media, whether it's the mainstream media, which could be CNN, NBC, Bloomberg, Forbes, etc., or the professional wine magazines like Wine Enthusiast, Wine Spectator, and of course the Jewish media. Look to the our core market, so that could be Hamodia, Yaten Neman, the Jewish Link, the Jewish Press, Ami Magazine, Mishpacha Magazine, and so on and so forth. The other part is advertising. Advertising means, contract, negotiate with publications and websites and radio channels and TV channels, and do advertising to promote those brands. And last but not least, there's the wine education part. Wine education part includes it's mixed also, of course, with the PR, but not exclusively. So I publish regularly articles about the kosher wines that we import and distribute, but in an educational manner with explanations that are really informative for the consumers. And at the same time, I also do events, tastings all over the States, all over America. With private consumers in private homes, with charity organizations, with shuls, to really talk about wine. The kosher market, the Jewish market, is still relatively new to wine. Kosher wine of quality is only about 40 years old. Most people are still learning about it, whereas in the big world out there. There are not so many. There are of course a lot of people who know about wine. There are a lot of people who don't know about wine. But it's a completely different perspective when like any other product that can be kosher or non-kosher. When you have just a huge choice and you can pick whatever you want, versus when you're limited to a selection of products, which nowadays. There are close to 4,000 different kosher wines being produced in the world. That sounds like a lot, but again, it's still a drop in the ocean compared to the non-kosher wine world. But yes, that's really that's the progress that we have witnessed over the years. New generations are really more interested than our parents and grandparents were about wine. It's a completely different perspective. The people who actually drink the most kosher wine nowadays are the millennials, the people who were born over the past 30 years. And those people have actually they grew up with some good wine because there were already good wines when they were born, versus our parents and grandparents who just had sweet kiddush wine, sacramental wine, like they're called, and there was not that much to speak of in terms of quality.
So I want to pick up on this education piece because that's really, I want to focus on that in our conversation. But before I do move into the education piece and background and history of the kosher wine landscape, especially in the U.S., I'm curious about the generational aspect. Have you found it really is such a difference of maybe people in their 20s and 30s versus, let's say, 50s, the baby boomers, right, in the 50s, 60s, 70s, that there is a different orientation and appreciation of kosher wine these days? Yeah.
So I'll give you a very concrete example. Of course, we live in a world where social media is really is very strong. Instagram, Facebook, and you have all those kosher bloggers, all those Jewish bloggers, many, if not most of whom are women, religious women who are in their 20s or 30s, usually married. And I'm not going to name any in particular, but for the most part, they're that generation who always promote. Some of them are actually cookbook authors. They are out there that sometimes 30, 50, 100,000 followers on Instagram. And they're called social media influencers, which I am one of personally on a smaller scale. I have two Facebook groups, one in English, one in French. It's called Kosher Wine Sharing and Experiences. Between the two, there are close to 10,000 followers. I have about 1,000 followers on Instagram. So it's a far cry from 50,000 or 100,000 followers, like some of those kosher food bloggers. But in the very small niche market of kosher wine geeks, it's still pretty sizable. So we have that generation, those young people for whom wine is no longer just that stuff that you drink for kiddush on Shabbos or Yom Tov. It's a fine, interesting beverage that you drink to socialize, to enhance your meals. It's very strange, I'm talking about social media influencers socializing, and we're in this age of coronavirus, COVID-19, with social distancing. But you know what?
But social distancing is more about physical distancing than it is
That's true.
social.
That's true. But those social media influencers, which is, again, it's on social media, so it's social distancing par excellence, because it's all virtual. It's on the screen,
Right.
on the smartphone or a computer. However, they promote a lifestyle, which includes obviously concrete socializing with real people in real life. And wine, whether it's being shared between friends, between a husband and wife, family members, at a meal, whether it's a birthday party or just a regular Tuesday night dinner. It's something that's as enjoyable and as legit as a nice steak, and that's something that just up until a few years ago only didn't really exist. People, Jewish people, were not really talking and considering wine as part of their daily or weekly routine.
You mentioned what was that winery way back you mentioned in California? Hagafen.
Yeah.
Right. So Hagafen, you're saying, was the first one?
Was the first kosher winery, fully kosher winery, in America. Yeah, they were founded in 1979.
Okay, wow. And so then, what's happened? I mean, there was Manischewitz, right? The Manischewitz wine that was sort of big, especially in the 50s, 60s, 70s.
Yeah.
And then along came Royal Wine Corps in what, the 80s, 70s?
So much before that. So Royal Wine / Kedem was basically started in the late 1940s, early 1950s. And they started with the grape juice, but of course a very large array.
In the U.S.
In the U.S. in New York State, just like Manischewitz, by the way. A large array of kosher wines, but they were there. They still exist. All those Kedem wines are still produced. They do very well. They're very successful, and a lot of people who have the tradition basically to drink those wines are still drinking them. They're not made from the noble grape varieties like we call them. They're made from local New York State varieties. They're relatively simple wines. They're not the sophisticated type that could be compared out there in the big world. And Manischewitz did the same thing up until today. The difference is that Kedem, the Herzog family, who own and operate Royal Wine and Kedem, decided that they wanted to revive their own family tradition, because their tradition of winemaking goes back to the middle of the 19th century. They had a winery in Czechoslovakia where they produced both kosher and non-kosher wine. And they were the official purveyors of wine to the Tsar. And that's how they got Philip Herzog, was named Baron by the Tsar back in the 19th century. And that's how the Baron Herzog became a thing, and that's why they called their winery in California Barton Herzog back in 1985. So the Herzog family, they're successful with their grape juice and their Kiddush wines, but they wanted to expand and go back to that tradition of producing fine, dry wines that would be kosher. And they first started by importing wines from all over the world. So they were sourcing, either kosher wines that were already being made abroad, or they're actually contracting with wineries to produce kosher wines in their non-kosher facilities. In 1985, they decided to open their own winery in California, Barton Herzog Wine Cellars, which is nowadays just known as Herzog Wine Cellars. And that came 6 years after Agafen was founded. And there are other wineries back in California that were kosher that opened in the 1980s, such as Winestock and Teal Lake. Both were acquired by the Herzog family later on. And then there was also Ganeden Winery, which was also opened in 1985. And that's really the history of American kosher wine. Royal Wine was already active in importing the first kosher wines from Israel. So from Carmel Winery, from the Golden Heights Winery, from Barkan Winery later on. Nowadays, Kedem Royal Wine, which has about 80% of the kosher wine market in America, brings in over 120 different brands, different labels of kosher wines.
Was there a big jump at some point, maybe the mid-'80s, the '90s? At what point did it really explode in the last few decades?
Okay, so 1980s, the birth of kosher wine in America, really. In the 1990s, you can see, first of all, French wine, kosher French wines, which start popping up from the better known wine growing region in France, which was also an initiative of Royal Wine. And you start seeing more and more of those wines, some very, very well-known names, very highly respected in the non-kosher wine world. But of course, to Jews, other than those who, had been exposed one way or the other, those names didn't mean anything.
You mentioned it was an initiative of Royal Wine to go into those areas.
So what happened exactly was there's a guy, there's a great guy, he's a friend of mine. His name is Pierre Miodovnik. He's a Frenchman. He lives in Israel now. So he was a winemaker. He became a Baal Tshuva in the 1970s, and he wanted to keep making wine after he did Teshuvah, so he wanted to make kosher wine. Yeah. And in 1982, he produced his first kosher wine, which was called Chateau de Palazza, from a small region in the south of France. And but his dream was to produce some great wines from Bordeaux in kosher, something which basically didn't exist back in those days. And he went over in 1986. He went over to the Rothschild, the famous Rothschild, from the banking, the philanthropy, Baron Edmond de Rothschild, who was already, his family, his father and his grandfather and his great-grandfather were great contributors to Israel and to wine in Israel. Baron Edmond de Rothschild from the 1880s. Is the one who actually financed and founded Carmel Winery long before the establishment of the State of Israel. It's really thanks to him that there is actually a wine industry in Israel now. Went over to Rothschild, who owned a few wineries in France, and said, how about we make a kosher Rothschild wine? So they produced the first Pierre Medovnik produced in 1986 the first ever quality kosher wine in Bordeaux, France. Bordeaux, which until today is still the better known, most prestigious wine region in the world. And he needed to sell that wine after he had made it. He reached out to Royal Wine, and eventually Royal Wine decided to import that wine. So they saw an opportunity, quality kosher wine from France with the Rothschild name on the label. So they started importing that, and just a few months after that happened, they bought out Pierre Medovnik from his own company in France. They hired him as their head kosher winemaker in Europe. They founded Royal Wine Europe, and Pierre Medovnik's role was to reach out to all those prestigious non-kosher wineries in France, in Spain, in Portugal, convince them to produce kosher wine. And that's what he did. And he did that for almost 30 years. Over those 30 years, he produced many, many, many high-end and not so high-end, high-quality, interesting and different kosher wines that never existed before. His successor, who was his right hand for 20 years, Menachem Israelevich, took over in 2014. Keeps producing more and more great wines in France. And in Spain. In the 1990s, it was really the rise of kosher French wine. And then in the 2000s, so somewhere in the late 1990s, early 2000, besides the big Israeli wineries that most people have heard of, such as Carmel or Barkan, there was a new movement, the boutique wineries movement. So there were a few wineries, small wineries of very passionate people that opened in Israel. Some of them in the 1980s, most of them in the early, mid-1990s, such as Castel. And they're not, for many of them, they're not making kosher wine. They're making wine in Israel that was not kosher certified. Those were small productions because they didn't have kosher certification. They could not be sold to kosher restaurants. Came Royal Wine and reached out to Castel Winery in 2002 and told them, look, being not kosher in Israel and selling wine, you're limiting yourself quite a bit. Going kosher is not so complicated, especially in Israel. So how about you go kosher, and we'll buy as much wine that you will produce as you want from that first vintage. If you want us to buy the entire production, we'll buy the entire. They grew their production and their sales manifold, and many other wineries followed suit. And nowadays there are so many boutique wineries, and some of them which have become really commercial wineries, producing 500,000 barrels a year.
So how much did it become imported versus the grapes actually grown and the wine produced here in the U.S. throughout the last few decades?
Those numbers, I don't really have them.
Even in broad strokes throughout the decades.
Yeah. So let's say that back in the late 1990s, early 2000s, there are about, let's say, 3 million barrels of kosher wines being sold in America. In 2020, that number has probably quadrupled, if not more than that.
Yeah.
Both because the wineries here in America, the kosher wineries in America, have expanded tremendously, but because there are so many kosher wines from Israel and from other countries, that has become an important industry.
I do have a question. Switching gears, Bartenura, right? Bartenura is a Royal Wine brand.
Yep.
What was the genesis behind Moscato d'Asti? Right. That is clearly that is a huge brand for Bartenura, right?
Oh yeah.
Right?
So
And now,
Bartenura is.
I saw commercials on TV in LA for it.
Bartenura is a big milestone. So Bartenura was started in the 1980s, early 1980s. So it's not so new. And it was a brand basically of affordable, inexpensive Italian wines, most of them red wines. And in the 1990s, they started producing. So it's a brand that is owned by Royal Wine from the get-go. They started producing a Moscato back in the 1990s that was in the beginning being sold in a green glass bottle and with very old-fashioned label. And in 1999, they decided to redesign the entire packaging, and they felt that they wanted to do something original, something that would make they saw that Moscato in America was growing in popularity in the general market, not in the kosher market specifically. And so they decided they had the vision. The Herzog family had a vision. They decided, we have a good Moscato. Bartenura Moscato, the quality was good, the price was good, it was competitive. Thought that with an interesting packaging that looks good, appeal to consumers beyond the kosher market.
Yeah.
So they made that blue bottle with a beautiful label. They're very they paid a lot of attention to really source the best grapes. To produce really a high quality Moscato that everyone would like, regardless of it being kosher. Thanks to the packaging, that was picked up by certain communities and celebrities. The wine ended up in hip hop clips. Bartonura Moscato exploded. So nowadays, Bartonura Moscato, is safe to say that at least 80%, if not 90%, of the sales of Bartonura are not in the kosher market. And this has grown into almost 800,000 cases. That's close to 10 million barrels being sold every year.
For Royal Wine, how much of it is the
in percentage? I don't know exactly, but it's a pretty important percentage. Yeah,
it's probably the biggest seller for Royal Wine, right?
Yeah, it's a huge brand. It's a huge product. Not just a product. It's a line. There's not just the Moscato. There's a sparkling Moscato. There's the Prosecco. There's a sparkling Rosé, and all those products are really growing in popularity and Baruch Hashem selling very, very well. And again, Bartenura has become a brand of wine that is not specifically Jewish or kosher. It just happens to be kosher, just like Ben and Jerry's or Häagen-Dazs ice creams happen to be kosher.
Right. I mean, like you mentioned, it really hit the popular culture and has really taken off.
Yep. And it's not the only product. Herzog wine cellars produce separate brands. It has become a separate brands over the years called Jeunesse, which are semi-sweet wines. And they produce 85,000, 95,000, basically a little bit over 1 million barrels a year of Jeunesse. Yeah. And it was recognized. It was a very innovative wine, Jeunesse Cabernet Sauvignon. It was a wine that was made from quality Cabernet Sauvignon grapes from California with a little bit of sweetness. It was not a sweet wine. It was not a dry wine. It was somewhere in between. That in-between sweetness for Cabernet Sauvignon from California was something totally new when that was released to the market. And
really? There was nothing else like it? Like it was totally new?
Not really. If there was, it was not marketed well. People didn't know about it. People took notice, and that took off also. And also a large part is sold in non-kosher world.
What was the thinking behind it? I mean, how was it created?
There are always people, especially Jewish people, but American people in general, they have a sweet tooth. They like the sweet stuff, and which is why many Americans, not just the Jews, often don't like dry wine. The Herzogs were like, you know what, you don't like dry wine, but you also, some people were like, yeah, we like the sweet wine, but they don't drink that much of it. It's just a thing like that. The thought process was, if we can do something of quality with a level of sweetness that's somewhere in the middle, something that is tasty, that is easy to drink, perhaps that will lead also people to expand their horizons, try something new, perhaps be a gateway towards more sophisticated wines, drier wines as well. And that has worked very, very well for many people. I cannot count how many people have actually told me that thanks to Jeunesse, they got into wine. They got to try other things. Otherwise, they would have never come close to try dry wine. It's good that you also bring it up, because it's a very important milestone, I think, in the history of kosher wine, at least in America.
So, Gabriel, have there been any trends you've noticed recently?
Yeah. So what happened is that back in the days, I'm talking 15 years ago, something like that, kosher wine and non-kosher wine, the mainstream wine world and the kosher wine world, were really completely separated. People were drinking different things. There was no really a connection really between the two, between the consumers of both worlds, and that has completely changed actually, because what happens now, and that's another sign that shows those millennials I was talking about before, but also the generation we live in right now, is that the trends that are actually taking place in the mainstream wine world eventually reach the kosher wine world. So, for instance, over the past 5 years, a little bit more than that, rosé wine, pink wine, took off in the mainstream wine world, became very, very big. Just a few years later, that took off also in the kosher wine world, and it's not going anywhere. Actually, yes, it is going somewhere. It's going up. And the same is happening all the time now with everything. Whenever there is a trend that goes on in the mainstream wine world, it eventually reaches the kosher wine market. So I could say the same thing about sparkling wines. I remember when I first started working with Royal Wine a little bit over 4 years ago, sparkling wines, champagne, but not just champagne, sparkling wines from America, from Italy, from Spain, were very hard to sell. Kosher wine consumer was not really interested. And sparkling wine took off in the non-kosher world 3 years ago. The producers really cannot keep up with the demand. People want champagne. People want sparkling wine from California, from South Africa, from Spain, etc. And that trend, of course, now reached the kosher wine world, and Royal Wine, and I'm sure also the competitors, really cannot keep in stock their sparkling wines. They come in, they come out. That's crazy. We're really struggling sometimes to sell one batch, one production of kosher champagne over 18 months, and now they come in, and 2 weeks later it's out. So that's really phenomenal, and that's why we keep track of what's happening in the mainstream wine world, because we know that we have to be there, and we have to anticipate the needs and the demand in the market, because those trends will reach the kosher wine world.
Gabriel, thank you so much for joining us on the show today, and I appreciate your time. Thank you so much. This is really great.
Well, thank you, Rabbi Drew. It's really a pleasure. Looking forward to talking again, and to this podcast.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you so much.
Take care. Be safe.